everyone. We will be recording this session.
Hey.
So, Julie, please hit the button.
Great. I think, yeah, it's recording your side. Is it?
Yeah, I think
Yes.
it's
Yes.
recording.
Okay, great.
Shows the sign it's recording. Super. So, hello everyone. Very pleased to have you all today in our CF Web Cafe series webinar. This is Marwa Debey. I'm an architect and professor of environmental and sustainable architecture at Malmö University in Sweden, and I'm here as my capacity as CF Vice President. CF is the International Scientific Committee on Vernacular Architecture, which is an ICOMOS entity. Today we have the honor and pleasure to invite Julie Nicholas and Travis Thomas to give us a wonderful talk today. And all of us are super curious about their recent research, and their topic today is entitled At the Edge of Knowing, Reframing Melrose Through Pyrovernacular Histories. And all of us are super curious about this new term, but Julie and Nicholas will, Travis will tell us a lot about it today. So to introduce Julie and Travis, I will say a brief about their wonderful background and CV. So I hope this will pay them a little for the wonderful background they have. So Julie is a senior lecturer at the University of South Australia. She is leading the research that bridges cultural heritage and regenerative co-design practice with the First Nations communities in Australia and Indonesia as well. So Julie, as a director of VKRG and co-director of LTC MAP, she integrates methods of architectural ethnography with digital and manual documentation in her research, and this is, I think, is very unique. Julie's emergent field, pyrovernacular studies, examines cultural burning and vernacular sitting to inform resilient built environments. So Julie's research prioritized participatory community-driven methods, advancing disaster recovery, adaptive reuse, and culturally responsive regenerative design through the ACHI method and Vernadoc. While Travis has served as co-lead for the First Nation Clean Energy and Emissions Reduction Advisory Committee, he also chair and co-chair several organizations and cooperation, and as part of his role, he has worked with the South Australian Aboriginal community, controlled organization network around Closing the Gap initiatives, and advocacy for the First Nation community controlled organizations. Travis has also been advocating and assisting in the advancement of the First Nation interests, sharing and protecting culture, and the incorporation of its values into policy and practices across multiple sectors to generate better outcomes for First Nations. So without any further ado, I leave the floor to both of you to share with us your work. It would be great if we can keep the talk around 40 minutes. I will try to give you kind of heads up 5 minutes before this 40-minute sticks. And then we will leave some time for comments, questions, and reflections. Thank you so much again for accepting our invitation, and we're pretty much looking forward to listen to your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the lovely welcome.
Yes. Thank you so much, Marwa and Hossam, for having us. And so Travis is joining us as well, like in between his jobs. So we'll crack on. So thank you again. Like, this topic is a collaborative project, definitely between Travis's expertise and I guess my expertise. So where we co-developed this talk. So first of all, the talk and work more broadly is about finding ways to reveal intangible histories. And so one of the problems we find in Australia is there's a particular silence in the archive around and absences in architectural history. So despite, in this case, the proximity of early colonial settlements like Melrose in South Australia, and we'll explain where that is, to Aboriginal camps, architectural histories rarely acknowledge the influence of First Nations spatial systems in shaping their siting or survival. while historians note the presence of Aboriginal villages, their focus often remains on ecological factors rather than on settlement strategies or conceptual or ideological influences. So one scholar, Tim O'Rourke from Queensland, an architectural historian, his work notably does address this gap by foregrounding Aboriginal spatial practices. And there is some literature that debates the metaphorical or figurative use of Aboriginal knowledge in architecture. But on the whole, the reliance is typically on written records, and these are scant and sometimes misleading if they're by colonial archaeologists and anthropologists. So this is why we're interested in developing this work. Hopefully this changes. Right. So this is quite famous book in Australian context, at least, is Gunya, Gundi and Worley, which is by Professor Paul Memmott from the University of Queensland. And his work tries to identify this gap. Sorry, my changes on the computer are not working. Oh, there we go. All right, so where specifically, or where Nukunu country is located, is where this talk is focusing, which is in Melrose in South Australia, so the bottom south coast of the Australian coastline, but inland from there. So South Australia's northernmost colonial outpost of the 1850s, with no sourced archival evidence, links the township's location to nearby Nukunu shelter tree camps. And despite their strategic value, proximity to water, cultural burning zones and fire-resistant natural shelters. So such omissions reflects an epistemological bias, privileging permanent surveyed built forms over oral, ecological and vernacular spatial practices. So, but however, in Nukunu oral histories, there is record of Nukunu guides acting for first settlers, explored to identify transit routes, water, shelter, suitable locations for their camps. Did you want to talk to that, Travis?
Yes, so we have within our oral history, and even speaking with a lot of obviously settler sort of families. My family comes from obviously a First Nations background, but also the first settler background. So I have perspective from both histories of knowledge being passed down from either side of the experience. So it puts me in that unique position. And we know that when we were approaching space from a First Nations and Nukunu point of view, it was about shaping it, and that the space has been tailored to survive in conjunction with the surrounding country. So Nukunu look at country, when I refer to country, I'm talking about everything around in the surrounding space that people are occupying, and their approach to that space is a holistic one. They're looking at everything being interwoven and interconnected. And as they approach that space, they're looking how they can shape it, but in a way that it doesn't cause extreme harm to that space. It enables co-survivability with the surrounding species. And that's about approaching the space of creating through the use of things like fire, where certain plants will grow through the application of fire at certain times of the year in certain intensities in certain locations, and having that knowledge of being able to implement it and where to implement it to be able to shape that piece of country to make it a space that's livable and survivable. And then that goes further into the selection of species. So knowing what species you want to enable to grow, and in the spacing between them. For example, shelter trees, we're looking at things like the spacing between the canopies. so that it's an ideal spacing for the tree to grow to a large, healthy, obviously age, height, and dimensions. But it's also at a spacing which will be less likely to carry fire or unplanned fire. So by applying fire and clearing around the spaces below, stimulating growth of preferred species, which complement the living spaces in the preferred species of grasses and particular trees and shrubs, and looking at the use of country between the difference between high country, low country, and the species you want in each area, shaping it to suit livability, and knowing where those locations are and how they've been shaped. So we know where you would move through the landscape because you've cleared the landscape through the use of fire, in a sense that it's more open and easy to move through, and maintaining those pathways. So we know by guiding settlers through and acting as guides, they're using these pathways which were maintained and shaped to transit country, and that before full sort of colonisation had taken place and developments of structural centres, that camping locations which arose before becoming major or settlements or townships were selected where Nukunu had been residing, because they'd approached the area with that knowledge of space and livability, and that has been taken into decision making when locations have been chosen for European settlement during that colonisation period, and even going to things like knowledge of materials and what type of trees, for instance, might be useful, termite resistant, things like that. Same things being used by Nukunu, then applied into the settlement construction and designs.
Yeah, and this research responds to this sort of long-standing omission or exclusion of these Indigenous spatial knowledge practices. And whereas, as Travis is saying, the landscape and was very receptive to settler people, and evidence of their understanding that that was an Aboriginal settlement, it remains in the place names. Did you want to just talk to the Aoi names?
Yeah, so we can see even during colonisation, and evidence of the use of guiding can be seen in actual place names in the context of European mapping and first settler mapping. So even to the present day, there are remnant names, which a lot of them have been slightly misspelled, mispronounced, sort of misidentified in the correct exact naming, but some of them are correct, some of them are close to what the actual Nukunu word is. But we can see that these still exist within the mapping context of South Australia, and particularly on Nukunu country. And we know within Nukunu we have a word with ending in owie. So owie provides information to us in Nukunu language that there's water present at that site. So when there's any type of name of a location or an area that ends in owie, like Winanawi as an example of a name of a location, then that indicates that there's a type of water there. And it can often be descriptive of the type of water or descriptive of other things that are near there with water. And it's essentially giving information about what's in that space, what's located there resource-wise, and helping people to understand as they move through country where the livability aspects that they require exist. And that's translated into the map, which is currently being used in South Australia, the most current mapping up-to-date systems with a lot of those names which have carried through.
Mm. And so Melrose is a township in proximity to the shelter trees that we're going to talk about, was surveyed in 1853 and is typical of the rectilinear grid that was laid over the landscape in the 19th century. And again, its proximity to water was significant, and positioned as it was positioned at the base of what the settlers call Mount Remarkable, but in Nukunu's Warkalitja, and it served as a foothold for this frontier expansion. And so here you see the gridded arrangement of the city, of the township. And so Kim Dovey notes, architectural historian, that colonial urbanism often erased Indigenous geographies while appropriating their strategic advantages. What if the town's history, typically told through buildings and cadastral plans, was instead read as an entanglement with unacknowledged Aboriginal spatial logics? An organic orchard of Nukunu shelter trees just outside the township for the beginnings of the tree growth from Melrose showgrounds, which I'll show you in a second, show a pattern distributed logic of habitation, a living camp or vernacular constellation. And this is just outside the township in the red ellipse. You see all of those little dots are basically like a settlement of shelter trees, which we'll show you shortly in terms of what that means. So going back to the settlers again, this settler architecture here was made by colonial buildings whose knowledge was imported, improvised, and often unsuited to the environment. However, this early timber, slab, and pug building later gave way to simple stone forms, and Nukunu shelter making, grounded in ecological stewardship and oral instruction, included these fire-prepared trees serving as camps and spatial markers. Here's the stone buildings in Melrose, and here's the shelter trees. So did you want to talk to how they're made, Travis?
Yeah, so this was, that was that previous hut was made from a particular type of tree, which I referred to earlier about having the hut, which was two back, which has the termite resistant wood, and you can see that on the front of that, which was common in the settlers' constructions in the first sort of dwellings, because that termite resistance, which obviously they become aware of through the Nukunu use of those types of woods and species in those early periods. And then you saw obviously the stone construction one, and this is a shelter tree. So these are all in close proximity to each other, which is really good because it survived where a lot of these trees, which were in far more abundance throughout the region, have been sort of felled, especially during that initial period of colonisation. The wood used for things like supporting mining and construction of wharves and infrastructure. But the great thing about these ones is that they're sort of there and they're old, and we know the dates of them and that they were pre-colonisation. So that's how it helps us identify that spacing, which is consistent with our verbal knowledge from Nukunu, but it's there to be seen today. And that knowledge of the construction goes into that application of the fire, the selection of the locations, selecting locations around things like access to water, the livability, the weather impacts on those types of areas, locations of other key things such as species that can be used for medicine, species that can be used for different types of nutrition, for food, access to hunting areas. So the areas around these are shaped to enable essentially like a supermarket. And then what happens with a shelter tree is really through the application of fire and a particular technique using sort of mud and dirt and things. And over time, like a person may build a house, a person would be responsible for constructing their shelter tree. So over time, as they're passing through the area, they'd work on it bit by bit, and gradually hollow out a space which is able to be lived in, and then they'd line that with things like furs and make a comfortable space. It's sited according to prevailing weather conditions to enable that shelter, and sited and within the concept of the space, knowing around being able to apply that fire to go through the area to keep it in that livable sense and stimulate the right grasses and species with a low intensity fire, which will enable those trees to survive both in their construction, and then once they become that living shelter space, being able to burn the areas around it consistently without causing destruction of the tree or ignition of the tree. And the thing you have to remember is there's no fire trucks or anything like that back then. The use of fire is solely around knowledge of space, the right fire being applied to the right country, so the right type of species at the right time of the year to create the right intensity fire to generate stimulation of certain species, germination of seeds, which require the right type of fire, heat, and intensity to germinate, which then shapes what you have growing in that area. So it's a whole shaping of the terrain and country. And these trees are an indicator of that. Other types of shelters were also used, but they're not survivable. So things like, bark and wooden shelters that were constructed, other aspects were used to shape those locations. So things like water management, where they've used slate in those areas also to create water conservation and control water in those spaces around Melrose to create that livability. The Warkalitja, which the mountain which Julie previously mentioned, had significant cultural importance in a ritualistic and ceremonial manner for Nukunu. So we know that was a key location where a great deal of Nukunu people would gather, and we know sort of where they'd travel around that area and where they'd perform ceremony, and we still have that knowledge, which has fortunately been kept and handed down orally to us. So the fact that these sort of trees still exist in some of these areas where we know it aligns with the stories, and some other areas, unfortunately, have been cleared or impacted by things like unplanned fires being destroyed by them or clearance for agriculture or grazing or industry.
Yeah, and so here you see Travis and his dad as cultural burning practitioners that have, as he's describing, this lived experience of fire practices into spatial arrangements and survival systems. So, but the colonial documents record buildings placement, but they rarely account for this pre-existing knowledge on which settlements may have depended. Rather than defining architecture, we are trying to look at knowledge systems, environmental understandings, and cultural entanglements informed in the making of settlement. So some of these questions that we're asking is, how can pyrovernacular architecture or shelter made in dialogue with fire, land, and climate reshape built history in these frontier zones, and what methods can historians use to reclaim these erased knowledges without appropriating them? And here you see a whole strand of shelter trees on Nukunu country. And so here we look at some of the, the aim is not to therefore reconstruct this sort of lost Aboriginal structures, but to reposition the historiographical lens. And methodologically, it's integrating this oral understanding and testimony embodied in spatial memory. So conceptually, it's reframing architectural history from a site of extremity where survival required interdependence with country. So here, in doing so, this contributes to this sort of decolonizing of historiography by expanding what constitutes shelter and whose knowledge is architectural, and how environmental and cultural intelligence is embedded in the built environment. So this sort of idea of spatial proximity of these suburban Nukunu systems, that's what we're referring to, the shelter trees, to Melrose and the colonial planning is really interesting. So what's important here is that, as historian Bill Gamage has demonstrated, how this sort of pre-colonial Aboriginal land management shaped the open park-like environments that settlers favoured. And this is what Travis has been speaking to in terms of the management of this landscape. It's not, even though now it's running stock on it, previously it was maintained by cultural knowledge, wasn't it, Trav?
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, it's when we refer to country, as I said, referring to everything, and it's an understanding of how all those species interact. So an understanding of phyroecology, biodiversity, and all the systems which are around you, and then understanding how your actions impact each of those systems, and then using your knowledge to influence those systems to create these livable spaces and be able to move between them successfully around your piece of country, which you are the custodians of throughout the year, to be able to successfully survive in that country. And we know from some of those descriptions which Julie was talking about from those first settlers that are still in existence in records, that the shape of the Australian landscape was a particular way upon arrival, which is consistent with that management and that use of First Nation knowledge to create a particular type of landscape. And we also have within records that that landscape has changed post-colonisation once those practices were stopped in many areas, and has obviously been influenced through things such as clearance or removal of fire systems, the First Nations fire systems and practices, suppression of it in areas and things like that, which has then altered the vegetation and landscape format in regards to species composition, density, cover, and obviously that has an impact on things such as fire and the ability to successfully dwell in those spaces and practice industry or whatever it may be in even the sense of the modern context.
Yeah, so we're sort of suggesting that these shelter trees offer a morphology of settlement that resists colonial fixity. Instead, they present a relational and rhythmic sort of spatiality, one grounded in seasonal and topographical relationships, custodial knowledge, and land-based dwelling, not in enclosure but in continuity. And so yet this spatial arrangement suggests that the very viability of Melrose Township may have relied on Indigenous environmental knowledges, especially in a region that was marked by the outer limits of arable expansion along Goyder's Line. So Goyder's Line is originally with settlement was the line where if you went beyond it, the rainfall was insufficient for settler farming techniques. And so this is interesting in that the proximity of the shelter trees and the running along the line of the Willocra Creek were significant indications that there was water there. So this must have had some bearing on the location of Melrose. So Paul Memmott, he suggests that Aboriginal architecture was was less about construction and more about curation of the landscape in terms of this organisation. So this spatial entanglement, we're saying, between settler and Aboriginal presence demands deeper historiographical reflection. And were shelter trees simply convenient shade and rest stops to settlers, or did they become quiet guides to the viability of settlement patterns, markers of water, fire refuge, or of also location of food and of cultural values? So Memmott highlights that these forms of vernacular shelter were not architectural in the Western sense, but this ecological and socially embedded structure through which knowledge transmission, environmental ethics, and kin-based responsibilities occurred. So also another author that talks about this is Deborah Bird Rose, and she articulates that the trees, these trees are sentient beings, well, not just these trees, all trees, with agency, memory, and relational presence. And this ontological framework positions shelter trees as living ancestors and kin and integral to community identity, law, and continuity. Oops. So now we're looking at this notion of pyrovernacular specifically. And so it's partially in relation to what Travis has been talking about in terms of land management and maintenance, but it's also what we're sort of suggesting is this relationship between fire and building and siting. So and so these trees signify this sort of relationship in their fire-shaped generation, and they're still living as a result. So the work that Travis does with his community is around this, well, it's cultural burning, but we're trying to relate it to the siting of buildings. So therefore, we've coined the notion of pyrovernacular. So this is an emergent term and uniquely defined in this research, and its conceptual underpinnings draw from these established theories in vernacular studies, as well as architectural ethnography. So scholars such as Marcel Vellinger and Del Upton frame vernacular architecture as dynamic, adaptive practice rooted in everyday environmental negotiation and relational knowledge systems, which really fits this notion of pyrovernacular in Australia. And so in contrast to colonial shelter that was constructed using imported materials, typically stone and timber, there was this sort of attempt to domesticate the environment through clearing, fencing, and cropping. So early colonial architecture in Melrose reflected pragmatic responses to local material availability and transportation limits, with most structures constructed from locally quarried stone or often soil and clay used from local ceremonial Nukunu ochre pits, and then as well as timber, and then later on corrugated iron. So even in the most rudimentary settler shelters, these built in haste without architects, obviously, had to respond to fire, wind, and resource constraints. And they may have drawn on the logic of the fire-shaped land without recognising the direct origins. And this particular building is on one of Nukunu's properties. I'm moving a bit faster now because we're getting close to time. So buildings such as the police station, courthouse, and early settlers' cottages were typically sited only on the natural contours of the Warkalitja plain, and they were close to water sources and along travel routes extending north from Adelaide. And the settler architecture used, again, this reference to stone, and then they started to incorporate these wide verandas as a climatic response, but they adhered to the settlement patterns of the cadastral logic.
And I think also on that and those settlement locations, knowing where our sort of key areas were through our stories of those shelter trees, and even where they've been cleared now, the spacing of them even within transit. So a day's walk and having another location where you could transit to a knowledge of where that was, where there's shelter trees, where there's water and those things. And that influenced then the guiding of those first settlers that arrived, and they're being guided through. And when they arrive, they've arrived from the coastal side and then had to be guided through. There's a large range which runs north-south. So they've had to be shown how to get through there to the side where Melrose is. And they've been transported through those sites with those spaces and that spacing, and where those spaces are and those terms, like with the Owie, we now see settlements of these types in those areas often.
Yeah. So this comparative lens reveals that shelter was not a singular architectural solution, but a cultural expression of ecological intelligence, Indigenous shelter systems, and offered a model of living with the volatility of fire and climate rather than seeking to dominate or eliminate it. The challenge then is not to romanticize these vernacular practices, but to recognize them as architecture, not in terms of buildings alone, but as techniques of survival, modes of shelter, knowledge transmission, and examples of human modified land relationships. So this calls for a broader and more relational architectural historiography, particularly in context shaped by these environmental extremities. So we've sort of suggested a few questions around future research and particularly the role of oral spatial memory, particularly, which is only really possible working directly with First Nations people like Travis to understand the kind of complexities around human modified land relationships that were not just ecological. They were completely controlled by First Nations people constructing space. And just in conclusion, so we've tried to argue here that Nukunu shelter systems, especially those shaped through fire and shelter trees, have been overlooked in this architectural history due to the discipline's narrow focus on permanence, built form, and written sources. By examining colonial Melrose, it highlights how settler survival was likely entangled with Indigenous spatial knowledge, yet historiography has privileged only colonial accounts. So this research shows that while settlers built out of necessity and limited environmental understanding, Nukunu practices embody deep adaptive intelligence grounded in relational systems of fire, water, food, and story. Oral histories and ecological practices are therefore proposed as valid architectural evidence in these frontier contexts. And ultimately, this is what we're suggesting here, is that recognising Indigenous shelter systems not as marginal but as integral challenges, and to sort of reveal those disciplinary blind spots.
Yeah, and I think for a little personal story, I suppose highlighting this sort of thinking line, I know from my mum's family, which is a settler family right through Nukunu country, that I'm not sure which one was like a great grandfather on that side that was actually sent out to act as a shepherd and settle an area. And he was sent with when he was 12 with a 12-year-old Nukunu lad. So it was just the two of them sent out, and that Nukunu lad was acting as a guide for him, and they stayed together and they built a hut. The hut went into ruin, but then it's since now recently been rebuilt. It's not owned obviously by our family anymore, but it's still there. So the hut's still there, which aligns with this story, but there's no records of who that Nukunu lad was, any names or any records like that. It's just a verbal story we have from that settler history also.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Judy and Travis, for this wonderful overview. And I think it's extremely unique, the type of shelter trees that you showed us. I think I personally haven't seen it anywhere else. So definitely it's a typology that worth recognizing, documenting, and also sharing the dynamics behind it. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to get to know about those vernacular shelter trees. I think it will be a nice cozy discussion now, because now we have even a nice group to discuss your work and share some curious questions or reflections. So maybe I can open the floor if Hossam and Kate, they have any questions or they would like to share some thoughts.
I wanted to say thank you to you both because it's a wonderful presentation and as Mara was saying, a really interesting topic to really be exploring. It's something, and I may have missed this, so my apologies, but something I was trying to understand is through fire management, right? Was there also extraction of trees as well as planting of trees, or it always worked with what was given, what the
Yeah,
hands?
so with the use of fire, essentially it's using an intensity of fire to selectively burn for particular species. So by applying fire around certain ages of saplings and things like that and controlling that application of fire at the right intensity, it'll cause certain ones to germinate. And then when you keep reapplying that fire around those things of a certain age, it will inhibit the growth of others. So, in effect, through the use of that fire, you're stopping certain saplings or seedlings emerging and you're enabling others to continue. So, it's, the use of fire to actually stimulate growth of some things and maintain species composition. So, even you can exclude certain species. So, for instance, when seeds are transported by wildlife or water flow down creeks and things like that, there's a particular tree type that the seeds will be carried from high country up in the hills down from there along creek lines, and they'll start to grow out from those creeks, as an example. And we can see now where fire hasn't been applied, those trees are growing out from those creeks further than they would. And when you apply fire, those saplings actually get destroyed because there's not a species which is suited to fire in that type of country. It's a high country species. We can also see that by things like its root system. So it's got broad, flat roots, which are designed for rocky high country, whereas the gum country, where it's the predominant species that belong there, have deep roots for that country and that type of soil. And we can even see that now through things like soil analysis, the composition of the soil, and through our stories of what was there, what should be there, is in Nukunu stories.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, if I may, I mean, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and very, inspiring work, research work. I mean, like, it's really um, an addition to our knowledge, and I'm sure it would be an addition, when published to the field of vernacular architecture. You know, when I was studying architecture, we were told that the vernacular is not architecture; it is building. It's, I learned the history of architecture from Sir Bernard, I think Bernard Fletcher or something like that. So I think all architects around the world had to learn history of architecture from that Fletcher book, which did not recognize the vernacular as architecture, but as buildings, just similar to what the animals and birds do to shelter themselves, and with no cultural or civilizational kind of value. Of course, we moved away from that quite a bit, but still, the fact that architecture is really, I mean, like that. Actually, we create architecture to adapt to the environment and not really to in isolation from the environment. That actually we normally would be living in the environment and would be understanding nature and the environment. And architecture is to as an interaction with the environment. Protection when it is harsh, and but then to keep the connection with the environment, and that is lost with the big cities and the modern architecture and the sophisticated kind of monumental architecture. But it's really so refreshing to learn about this, this knowledge, this Nukunu knowledge and experience and interaction with nature. Really amazing, and I think it's really Now I understand why you say pyrovernacular, which is, yeah, I mean, English is not my first language, and I had to Google what pyro means, and it tells me to do with fire. So when I was following the presentation, I could understand. Okay, now I understand. So it's really amazing, and it's so eye-opening, really. Uh, Maybe a question out of total ignorance is there a kind of like bigger meaning or symbolic or mythological uh, place for the fire, and how this, and how this shelter tree is, I mean, like, apart from the practical and the, the understandable kind of like view of it, because very often, looking from outside, you would only see the tree, you would see only the practicality of how this works. But is there something that's to do with the, I don't know, maybe the worldview, the beliefs, the
Yes,
mythology?
certainly. Yeah, certainly. So fire has a whole range of I suppose various um, levels of importance within Nukunu culture and also other First Nations culture in Australia, and various aspects of the way it's viewed. So there's obviously the practical, I suppose what I refer to as practical aspect, which is that used to influence country and train and shape it, which is kind of where we sort of focused around a bit, because it's obviously to do with architecture and shaping and spacing. But fire has an intrinsic spiritual connection for Nukunu and other First Nations in Australia. It's it's used in ritual, so there's a ritual connection. So the use of it connects a person to a space. So the ritual is being used to, shape a person's mind and connect them to that point in time and that location and to a particular activity or knowledge system around that spirituality or ritual that's being undertaken. So it's shaping the person's perception and sense of being and belonging, and often in that use of that fire and in those types of ceremonial aspects and ritualistic aspects, they're being delivered knowledge at the same time. So in that regard, where these shelters trees are is a living space, but around it is a ritual space as well, where fire is used ritualistically for ceremonies, for acknowledging things. Like a ritual can be a change in life, a point in time, initiation things, all of these types of practices. The use of it, its application in cooking, even the consumption of food is seen as like an animal giving its life force to the person consuming it. So everything has a dynamic of spirituality and ritualism, and that goes into the living space where there's stories aligned with where Nukunu have been told to live, what from creation beings. The creation beings have shaped the landscape, provided knowledge. So near Warkalitja, one of our creation beings has spoken to Nukunu ancestors to give them knowledge and to give them knowledge of the area, and that's recorded in our oral traditions and stories. What we call as Wipma, which is Nukunu for dreaming. So that dream culture, and when we look at a space, so we look at country, everything's intertwined and connected, including the people within that, and then the spiritual system and the law. And the law is intertwined with the species. So we have totemic species and obligations to country, looking after country, caring for it. And beyond those types of things and the law and all of that, it goes even into sort of the knowledge system being directly linked to place. So as you go through a piece of country, you have songs and stories, and you'll be given stories about a place and laws at a certain place at certain times and points in the life, and that links with the rituals and the fire and the living space and all of those things. So it's all intertwined and interwoven, most definitely.
Mm.
Amazing.
And that also goes into that different approach to space from the early settler perspective, where they're looking at from that almost Socratic viewpoint of having that scientific and predominantly Christian background of approaching the space from how is our sort of European settler experience of using landscape, as they'd refer to it, where it's like, okay, we divvy up this piece of land, we put them into parcels, we sell them. This is agricultural land, this is commercial land, this is industrial land, this is mining, versus in a Nukunu knowledge system approach to country, because we say country because country is at all of those things of your spirituality, your environment, the ecology, you being part of it, and your interactions with all of it, it's intertwined. So there's two different approaches there also, and you have an obligation to country and to look after it, versus in the European sense, it's often manipulating country, which could be to the detriment of it, removing species, adding others, and having more extreme impacts on it. The other aspect with Nukunu culture is they look at the world as in we're in a physical world. So when we're there, we will see a thing like Warkalitja, which is a location where Whitmer is, where dreaming is. And we'll say behind that physical world, so behind that rock is, it's almost like another dimension where that Whitmer, that dreaming still exists. So we'll say in locations, there's behind the physical world we exist in is that other world that's still there, and time is not seen as linear, it's seen as sort of also in that holistic sense. Yeah.
On that point, from a non-Aboriginal perspective, it's really interesting, like going to this, like I just put up this slide again, the cultural burn, because when the burn's happening, the country is so holistically is so responsive, and even though Travis has spoken to my students about this many times, being there and witnessing what's going on is really insightful for the way to organise buildings around these ideas. So yeah, it's been a really revealing kind of process.
It's gonna I'm fascinated by your project, you guys. I think it's, as Hassan was saying, there's so many beautiful aspects to what we see. It really, in many ways, seems like there's an opportunity as well to not only look at it through the lens of the vernacular, which is fascinating as we as people and how we inhabit spaces, but also pushing beyond the vernacular architecture into the cultural landscape aspect of this, and how that begins to frame your conversation even further. As you were talking, I was thinking about all these things. We deal with fires here in the American West, obviously not in the sensitive way that this was done, but it also feels like an opportunity that I'm thinking about this, how we can also learn today what we need to be doing to, in fact, protect our places, our settlements, and be sensitive to and part of that broader landscape. But as a cultural landscape, this has, I think, the opportunity, I guess is how I'm thinking about it, to really explore even more of the things that you're talking about. It's a beautiful study, and it's a really wonderful topic to be working on.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's spot on with your sort of similar experiences which be taking place over where you are, and you see there's probably a similar pattern around settlement and settlement practices. And I would suggest, without knowing, but there was probably a fire regime there practiced by the local First Nations people, which was probably interrupted with and removed, and that would then change that landscape. So what we're talking about here would be quite possibly applicable to where you are. I know through conversations with First Nations from people in Canada, there's similar experiences with fire there, and the sort of modern context of unplanned fires and catastrophic fires versus low intensity fires of those managed landscapes through that cultural burning and the living space. So, the burning around those living spaces and incorporating that fire in shaping country and the livability and the spaces and that incorporation of it in the planning of where they're living and how they're burning around their space. And I think it can be applied, the burning to, re-establish a healthy fire regime and burning the right way, the right intensity, the right time, the right country. But also, that knowledge of living systems of going, if we want to put a house here or whatever here, if we burn the right way, we'll get certain species there. And knowing what those species should be means if you plant those in the right vicinity of whatever you're building, you won't have as much chance of a catastrophic fire destroying those structures.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, this understanding and this knowledge system, this what you call it, indigenous knowledge practices, you called it, Juliet, one point of the presentation. I mean, like, it seems so ridiculous when we architects look at a building or at some intervention, and we just draw that building or that tree or whatever, and we think we have the understanding. I mean, like here we're talking about the nature, we are talking about the fire, we are talking about the meanings, we're talking about the history, and all that is inseparable. Otherwise, you wouldn't understand properly. And also to document, you wouldn't document properly if you just pick the tree or pick the building and just draw it and put it on a page, in a history book or something. And this is, I think, is so important because it widens our horizon and refreshes also our understanding, not only in this cultural setting, but also for us to take a step back and try to really refresh our common sense, because sometimes our academic and our intellectual exercises kind of blocks our common sense, and we look in such a kind of pigeonholing things. This is such an amazing example of how you need really to open up and to really to understand also there are all these experiences and ways of living with nature and worldview, understanding life, and within that the vernacular comes. It's not really the little drawings that we sometimes get obsessed with.
Sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Architecture has become so abstract,
I know.
abstracted from the environment and
And
culture.
away from even humans. I mean,
Yes.
it's becoming like we need to adapt to the architecture rather than it should be serving or
Adapt to us.
adapting to us.
Yeah, that's right. And that's
That's so
sort of
true.
what we looked at with one of our sort of projects been working on that property in Wilmington, which you saw some of the photos from, where we did that burn photo, and looking at how we incorporate that sort of approach to country and living into design of a building and the siting of it and all of those things. And yeah, that's sort of what we've been working on also, and hopefully we can achieve something there, and that'll be another good example we can use to hopefully highlight this sort of thinking. Yeah. Perhaps you want to talk to that a bit, Julie?
I think everyone might want to. Well, I think we've gone over our time, Travis.
Oh, yeah, easy.
Yeah, but I'm happy to talk about it another time. So, at length, in fact.
Yeah. But thank you so much for this wonderful. We will consider it kind of a start and a short overview, and then we are really interested to hear more about your work, and maybe we can also organize another session for that. We received actually a lot of requests from our CF members concerning the recording because they couldn't make it. So we are very happy that we were able to record this and share it with our CF members, and of course even beyond. So thank you so much again for this wonderful presentation and for giving us the opportunity to learn about your work. I agree with Hossam and Kate that this was really an eye-opener to a new type, a new typology, a new perception towards what we call, or agree among us as a vernacular scientific committee, what is vernacular in a broad sense. Thank you so much again, and especially that you took your time in late evening in Australia, so that means a lot to us, and we continue our intellectual conversation, and we stay in touch. Thank you so much again, and I wish you all either a good continuation of your day or a good ending of your day.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to some Nukunu culture. It's appreciated, and hopefully, we can share it with more of the world. Cheers.
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 Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Sorry,
Bye.
Julie, I had another meeting and the spillover went on for a long time, so I joined late.
No
Thank
worries.